society can think of painters as this untouchable breed of people who are at once unimaginably valuable, where a single painting can be worth millions and millions of dollars. And at the same time, they're also expendable. Like what they do isn't really, I mean, the first thing to be cut from education spending is the arts. Just yeah, it's like extra stuff. And artists starving is what you just sort of expect. When you're growing up, everybody always talked about starving artists, and
Yeah.
it's just weird. You know what I mean? There's just weird, not an easy place for people to fit artists in their worldview.
In these days, I've had this idea in my mind, and it's regarding what you just mentioned. No, it's more common to have like the image of the starving artist because I mean it's more common. I mean it's not a basic need, although it should be. But with this idea or this model of making the multimillionaire artist, the successful artist, it just made things even worse. It's like
Yeah,
this idea of the successful, rich artist and focusing in and making it into the elites. That made a complete disaster about art because art is
yeah,
not about elites.
yeah,
Art is about, as you mentioned, having the kids around, having,
yeah,
just bringing it to the people, making contact
yeah.
with
Uh,
other artists, and this elite.
abs Absolutely. Yeah, having conversations with people, bringing people together, not having a hierarchy of important people and less important people. I can't remember who it was, but there was maybe you'll know this quote. There's not good art and bad art. There's only art and damn little of it. You know, I think it was Barnett Newman or somebody unexpected like that. But the idea that you know, I mean, there's art that I favor. There's art that I love more than other art. There's art that you would love that I wouldn't feel as strongly about, and vice versa. I've got my favorite artists that I always go to, and they give me a certain feeling. I don't know why. Doesn't matter. Doesn't mean that they're better than other artists. And the idea that it's at all legitimate to have an artist go from selling paintings for a few $1,000s to selling paintings for $2 million, the same size, same amount of time. It is, it's just, it has nothing to do with the creative process. And it has only to do with a marketplace that, frankly, keeps artists as contained and controlled as possible. That's not a market that I'm friendly with. I don't think that's useful or healthy.
No,
You
and
know,
I remember when I was a kid, I mean, the decades ago, uh, the artistic community hang more freely together. I mean, you could go
mm,
to you could find a book or see a newspaper article around the opening of a show about him, but they were all together and they
right,
did different
right,
stuff and they had different prices and some
right, right,
were
right.
more academically formed than others, but they
Or
had more
experimental.
freely, more
Yeah,
free, and they were like in a more natural way hanging out together. Now it's like, no, I mean, you need to be published in this
right,
newspaper or in this by this critic, and if you're not covered by this, then you're not worth anything, and you're
right,
not part of us, and you're it's like, what is
right.
this?
Yeah, there's like this invisible that when we first started talking about, like, there's the starving artist and then there's the totally untouchable, eh, you know, eh, incredibly valuable genius. And you can go from one to the other. You can like pass through this invisible veil and then all of a sudden you move across and then you become that, and it doesn't make any sense. There's no magical transformation that's happened. It's just the market didn't see you before, and now they can make things from you. They can become rich from you. They can seem smart and relevant because of you. But the work itself may be no different. I was talking to This is a conversation that's fascinated me for years, uh, and it is always changing in my mind. But as a painter, you're faced with the question of where you fit in the world from the beginning, and I think it's a lifelong question, how you're supposed to relate as an artist, and that's how you also make a lot of your decisions about what you want your life and your career to look like. I remember I was friends with the late poet Bill Berkson, and he was really good friends with Philip Guston, who's one of my favorite painters. And Bill was a poet and also an art writer as well. And so he knew a lot about painting, loved painting, wrote about painting with a love and a curiosity. And I remember sitting with him in a diner in New York and him talking about how in the 50s in like the Lower East Side of Manhattan, uh, artists like Philip Guston and uh, and poets and musicians and dancers and filmmakers would all just hang out and do their thing. There was no market separating these things. It was all just people making things and making them together, collaborating, whatever. There were maybe a handful of galleries, a handful of, really rich art collectors, but it wasn't like a whole, global, commerce that is for only the super wealthy, which is where we are more or less. I mean, there's a gradation, but that's the art. When we talk about the art world, it's largely that super elite. And and nobody really had much expectation that they were going to get rich. They were hoping they would make really great work and make a great life for themselves. But the poets know they're not going to make much money off of their poetry. That's not why they get into it, And painters thought the same. And then all of a sudden, there's an art market that is like growing, and then there's pop art and Warhol and the '80s and all that stuff. And there was the possibility of becoming incredibly wealthy as a painter. Still, there's no expectation of a poet even being able to sustain themselves in their work. I mean, there's teaching involved, or other kinds of writing, or all sorts of things. But the idea of becoming super wealthy, I mean, it has to have an effect on people who go into painting, knowing that there's the possibility of selling this commodity that you're making at an astronomical price. And I find it all very interesting and extremely off-putting, and I'm now 51, and I'm still like trying to figure out where am I in relation to that? Because a lot of people think about that when they think about art, because they interact with, they go to a museum and they see, Rauschenberg, and they, Jasper Johns, and, Jeff Koons, whatever, and the price is completely astronomical, or it's just valueless. It's so revered, sanctified, or whatever, and it becomes a religious thing, in some ways. And I don't know. It's all, yeah. As a painter, where do you fit in to that? I mean, because we still have to make a living. There's still some sort of commerce and transaction that has to happen.
Well, we are sort of like in the same stage in life, and and somehow we sort of had a glimpse of how things were different back then. And
Right.
this thing, as you mentioned, of the price, not only a whole mess has been the result of it, but also as as speaking about the public, the possibility to observe, like to watch, to contemplate, is lost because of the price.
Mm.
And you don't see anything because it's just the price. It's how much it's worth, no? But there's, I mean, we lost the capacity to observe.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The idea, like it's hard to look at the work because the monetary value of it is so extreme and so absurd, and the only reason it's that valuable is not because of the work, but because of the artist. And there's so much the artist between you and the work. You can't look at a Picasso and not see it as a Picasso.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
which is, I mean, understandable. But what do you do with that? I was talking with I'm working on a book with the writer Kate DiCamillo, who's just wonderful, humble. She produces a ton of work, and it's so thoughtful and imaginative and compassionate. And working on this book together that is just everything for me right now in my studio. And we were talking about, these aren't really illustrations, they're paintings to go along with her writing, and it's more of a collaborative process than the publishing industry is used to between a writer and an artist. And it's more, I mean, I've been a visual artist and not a illustrator, but a you know, oil painter for all these years. And so I think about it more like I always thought about my poetry collaborations. I'd paint and the poets would write, and it was just a very organic, collaborative process, totally woven together. And we were talking just the other day about, how do I know when the painting is done or when the painting is working specific to this project? And it's like, when I stop seeing myself in it, you know, I don't see the author anymore. I just see the image. And that's, as a painter, that's what I'm looking for. I don't want to see myself. I want to see the image there.
Yeah.
And that's really hard if you're also making art stars, and celebrity out of artists. I I I think that probably the vast majority of artists don't want to see themselves reflected in their work. Why would you want that? And it's not that yourself isn't involved and woven into it, but it's not that's not the point of it.
Yeah, and it can be really naive, like to think that we as painters, I mean, it's very illusory, very naive to think that I do whatever I want to do with this image. I mean, painting is more powerful than ourselves. I mean,
Totally, totally,
they painting
totally.
rules over us.
Oh my God.
No?
Especially oil paint. For me, it's like I can't conquer paint and make it do what I want it to do. I mean, if I wouldn't even want to do that, even if I could do that, what's the point of doing that? Then it would only do what
Exactly.
I wanted it to do, and I'm not that interesting. But
Yeah,
you have to then be in a conversation with the paint at the very least and allow the paint to do what it wants to do. And the more that can happen, I'm getting myself out of the way as much as possible. That's the whole point of it. You
yeah.
know,
It's a,
I
like
don't,
a conversation, like a
yeah,
relationship where you need to, I mean, to really take account the other part. I mean, it's like listening to it, watching it, making
yeah,
it
you're observing.
possible. I mean, not like I do what I mean, I mean,
Right.
no,
I mean,
painting.
that's an interesting thing because I think a lot of painters there are a lot of painters who have, say, for instance, like a lot more control over their palette than I do. My palette is chaos, and it's just a lot of plastic plates covered in caked up paint, and I just throw them out and I start a new one. And I start out with some order, and then I just start painting, and it's immediately chaos. And I've tried to change that over the years, but have always returned to this. And I started to embrace that as like it's a really valuable part of how I paint and why I paint. I don't have very much control over this, but what I have control over is not the paint that winds up on the brush and then the paint that shows up on the canvas, but I have control over how much I'm paying attention to what that color does to the painting and working with it in that moment. And that's where the painting is. It's not in going like, okay, I can blend these colors to get this certain type of effect or whatever. Yeah, in a part, I think I learned that from one of my favorite painters, Pierre Bonnard, where there was always a little bit of contamination between one color. He would just drag his brush across and pick up. He's going for that blue, but if he picks up some purple and red on the way, that's, and you can see it. It's mud, but it's luminous. There's light in that kind of contaminated, unintentional, accidental, you know, uh, because you can see he didn't get the color right, but he was awake and aware when the color was going down and could make decisions that would turn a grayish, pinkish, yellow into like a light source.